Good afternoon. Most of the large-scale protests in Latin America took place shortly after the height of the Arab Spring, where I think optimism prevailed at the time, at least for a global audience, and the overthrow of a number of regimes in North Africa. As my colleague Virginia mentioned, there's a temptation to link events in different places to a broader trend of unrest. Just like there were attempts to talk about an African spring as a spillover effect from North Africa, I saw the term tropical spring emerging in the international press to describe protests in Brazil and other regions and other countries. However, the wave of unrest in Latin America did not come exactly after winter. On the contrary, mass protests in Brazil and other Latin American countries emerged in the context of established democracies, relatively strong democratic institutions, and economic stability. The countries hit hardest by mass disruptive protests like Brazil, Chile, and Peru were exactly among the best performing in the regions, with more than 2 decades of democracy, elections, and strong economic growth. The protesters in Brazil were not telling a simple story, and I want to focus on Brazil more because of the scale of the protests and the geopolitical implications of policy changes in Brazil, but I'll draw parallels with other countries in the region and try to extract regional political effects. The protesters raised many flags, initially about a very specific issue, the increase in bus fares in several cities. The protests quickly acquired a broader focus. Polls showed the majority of participants were in the streets because of the bad public transportation infrastructure. Corruption, healthcare, education also cited as causes. These are not new issues. Despite advances in social programs to redistribute wealth in Brazil, progress in public services benefiting the whole of society, and especially the growing middle class, have been much slower. The Brazilian state has had tremendous progress in expanding its reach to the poor sectors of the population, providing education, cash transfer schemes, and access to credit. However, the social changes during the past decade or so in Brazil have been faster and deeper than the changes in government policy. Social changes have been driven mostly by the significant economic growth during the 2000s before coming to a near halt last year. The social composition of the protests reflect these changes. Roughly half of them are or were in university, and their median income is more than $1,000, which is both higher than the average of the population. The protests in Brazil were a dramatic explosion of social and political grievances brought about by large-scale and fast process of social change during the last decade. Approximately 35 million people emerged from poverty during the previous decade. It was the fastest growth in middle-class population in Latin America and one of the fastest social changes the region has ever seen. Average middle-class income grew by 50% during this time. The number of university students more than doubled. The mass movements out of poverty was accompanied by an equally large scale of changes in perceptions and demands. It is worth mentioning that the rise to this middle class, or something close to it, meant higher demands but little change in what was delivered by the governments. This is broadly the case for the greater part of Latin America, which experienced a 50% rise in its middle-class population, a massive change during the past decade, according to the World Bank. Unlike the Brazilian government, however, the World Bank has included another social class to describe these people between poverty and the middle class, an extremely uncomfortable position characterized by rising demands and constant social insecurity, living under the risk of a return to poverty. Suggestively called by the World Bank, the vulnerable. This is currently the largest social class in Latin America, accounting for 38% of the population. Whereas consumption power has increased substantially, sparked by economic growth and government stimulus in some countries, appetite for consumption has arguably risen even faster. Consumption not just of items, but of quality services. The political system and public services in the region, which evolved slowly since the return to democracy roughly 3 decades ago, were confronted with a huge influx of new users, new requests for inclusion into the whole package of social experiences, including economic and physical security. One of the political effects of this rise of a middle class has been to turn accumulated grievances into a powerful fuel for mobilization. The proliferation of information sources and internet access in the region has changed the political landscape, providing this crucial link between a broad sense of frustrated aspirations and political mobilization. Latin America has registered the highest growth rate in online population in recent years and has consistently registered expansion of internet users above the global average, at least for the past decade. Brazilians, for instance, are among the most active users of Facebook and Twitter, and internet access has jumped from 3% of the population in 2000 to almost half of the population last year. Just like in many other protest movements around the world mentioned today, social media was a crucial tool in lowering the cost of political mobilization, to the point where achievement of consensus over specific demands is no longer necessary, and allowing for mass-scale connections to a broad and nationwide movement. Hashtags, Facebook discussions, and television images served as catalysts for social organization. The new and old middle classes were then able to link themselves to a variety of emerging social and political issues, according to the perceptions and experiences relevant to each group. It is no wonder that roughly half of the people in the streets in Brazil in June said they had never been to a protest before. A similar process took place in Chile, where mass student protests over education in 2011 expanded to include different issues in different regions, with social media and fast image distribution supporting the spread of the movement. Despite the severe impact on the popularity of political leaders, the protests did not seriously affect the capacity of the Brazilian government or other governments in the region to act or state stability. What they have caused is a significant adjustment in policies. Protests in Brazil, Chile, and Peru have had a successful track record of results. They have made policymakers turn back on decisions to raise prices for public services. They have sparked reforms in education, in the political system, new public investments. The regional effect of political mobilization, however, does not involve just one-off policy announcements, but a revision of the social contract of the countries involved. Governments in highly successful Latin American countries have been focused for too long in providing, on one hand, commodity-based economic growth and cash transfer programs benefiting the poor on the other. The rapidly expanding middle class and the vulnerable millions making their way towards it were left to make do with their own devices. They appeal to private education, private security, private transportation amidst a political environment that had been largely unresponsive to their complaints and concerns. The overall result is a substantial change in political relations and priorities. This middle class proved that it has the will and the capacity to vibrantly and sometimes violently demand higher standards of governance and living. By doing so, protesters showed that more than ever, failure to adjust policies and public services to this new social landscape is a potential source of strategic instability. Protesters mobilized in large scale with the help of social media can capture the attention and resources of governments, changing priorities and strategies. The price of mobilization was drastically lowered with the arrival of millions of people with information and the digital tools to organize themselves. The multiplication effect of the information age has dramatically increased the reach of their voices. In the tactical level, therefore, there has been a widespread change with the rising power of protest as a tool available for the middle class. A common challenge to Latin American countries affected by mass middle-class protests is to respond to the volatile nature of these protests. In addition to broad-based middle-class movements, the government, especially in Brazil and Chile, are also dealing with a violent strand of protests. Groups such as Black Bloc in Brazil and the Encapuchados, or hooded protesters in Chile, have in common a vague identification with anarchist ideas, little to no organizational structure, but a high degree of mobilization power. They have consistently mobilized hundreds of members through social media for disruptive interventions during protests, clashing with the police and destroying a wide array of business infrastructure in the streets. These violent groups increase the destabilizing effects of protests, increasing the costs for governments. of this new wave of mobilization. The Chilean and Brazilian governments are still trying to calibrate their responses, as police repression seems a viable deterrence at some times, but sometimes also result in violent images that only increase disruption. Finding the right response is a common challenge to governments in the region, which will affect the broader political impact of the movement. If the violent groups are able to repeatedly hijack protests and cause overreaction by security forces, it will undermine the government's reform efforts and risk creating prolonged unrest in the streets. As more protests are organized and dissatisfaction grows. A balanced approach to the protests, however, can result in an increased pace of modernization. Many of the demands being raised involve the same factors identified again and again as having held back further social and economic progress in the region. The protest wave has caused already an increase in government commitments for public investments and political reform. In Chile, the government reacted within months with plans for education and tax reforms. In Brazil, President Dilma Rousseff reacted within days by announcing the intention to reform the political system with the aim of making it more transparent and responsive, alongside other measures. By sparking a rapid rise in the scale and speed of policy adjustments, middle-class mobilization has significantly changed priorities and strategies in key countries of Latin America. Revising outdated institutional structures and reorienting government investment can result in a boom in productivity and social development, with many medium to long-term benefits. To conclude, I think the main conclusion of these past few months and years has been that a new force for political change has clearly emerged, fighting for large-scale reform of the social contract. Popular movements can include a plurality of interests and be organized through extremely loose alliances, but nonetheless retain visible power to foment change. It is, for now, an unfolding process that has already caused policy adjustments and reforms, and by doing so, rebalanced power in favor of a new and newly mobilized middle class. The strength and sustainability of its political mobilization will determine how broad its impact will be and whether new actors will emerge to challenge long-standing political forces in the region.